All right, guys. So really easy day after our sine, cosine, tangent stuff. Today we're talking about special right triangles. And there's really only two of them that we're going to worry about. The first one is right triangles that have two 45-degree angles. So there's a picture right here. Obviously, this is our 90-degree angle. And these are both 45-degree angles. So that means this is an isosceles triangle. And what's cool about isosceles triangles is if these two angles are the same, then these two sides are also the same. So that's why in the picture, this is labeled an S and this is labeled an S. Okay. So what's cool about 45, 45, 90 triangles is the short side, the legs of the triangle have a special relationship mathematically with the hypotenuse. Instead of having to do the long a squared plus b squared equals c squared to figure out what the hypotenuse is, it gives us a really nice formula that the hypotenuse is equal to the square root of 2 multiplied by one of the legs, which is s. So you get the square root of 2 multiplied by s. So if I have a 45, 45, 90, and it gives me a side, in order to get this hypotenuse, instead of using my big long formula, all I have to do is take that side and multiply it by the square root of 2. There's also another formula that's not on your paper, and I want you to add it. So I'm going to put and if the hypotenuse equals the square root of 2 times s, what if it gives you the hypotenuse and wants you to figure out what s is? Or in other words, if this works really great if I know the side and I'm looking for the hypotenuse. So if I know the side, I'm going to use this formula right here. But what if I know the hypotenuse and I want to look for the side? Well, all I have to do is get the side by itself, s, by dividing by square root 2. So the little side is equal to the hypotenuse divided by square root 2. So two formulas that I want you to know for an isosceles triangle, a 45, 45, 90. So the first one is if you know the side, use this formula. The second one is if you know the hypotenuse. So let's put that in here. If you know the hypotenuse, I want you to use this equation, okay? The other special right triangle is a 30, 60, 90 triangle. So one of the angles is 30 degrees, another is 60, and obviously it's a right triangle. So the third one is 90 degrees. In this case, we have a couple of relationships that, again, instead of having to use a squared plus b squared equals c squared, we have a couple of nice relationships. Now, first of all, in these formulas, for example, this first one uses the hypotenuse and the short leg. The short leg is always across from the smallest angle. So whatever's across from the 30, my short leg, so we can even put here, the short leg is always across from my 30-degree angle. Okay, the shortest leg is across from my shortest angle. All right, so the special relationship here is the hypotenuse is equal to double the short leg. So if I know my short leg is 5, then I know my hypotenuse is double that. Then my hypotenuse would be 10. Okay, so if I know my short side, I can find the hypotenuse. And if I know the hypotenuse, just like up here, if I know the hypotenuse, I can divide by 2 to figure out a side. So the short side is equal to the hypotenuse divided by 2. So this is if I want to work between the hypotenuse and the short side. Depending on which one it gives me, I'm going to use one or the other. So again, this one right here, this formula is if I know a side, and this formula is if I know the hypotenuse, okay? Now, what if I don't know, what if I'm not dealing with the hypotenuse? What if I'm dealing with the longer leg, this long leg right here across from the 60 degrees? So my long leg is equal to, and maybe let's give the long leg a name. Let's call it L for long leg. My long leg is equal to the square root of 3 multiplied by my short leg. Now notice the short leg is not underneath the square root. So my long side equals square root 3 multiplied by the short side. So in this case, if my short side is 5, all I have to do to get the long side is 5 times the square root of 3, and I'm done. And because this is true, if I know the long side, my short side is equal to the long side divided by square root 3. So I use this one right here if I know the long side, and I use this one again if I know the short side. Okay, so if I know the short side, I'm going to use this formula. If I know the long side, I'm going to use this one. Okay, so I have a lot of different relationships. These equations are true if I have a 45-45 triangle. These equations work if I have a 30-60. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to use those formulas to solve some side problems. So step 1, when I'm looking for the sides of special triangles, if I'm solving for a missing side, before I start looking at sine, cosine, tangent, a squared, b squared, I want to check the angles to see if I'm dealing with a special triangle. Obviously, I'm always going to have a 90 because those are the kind of triangles we're dealing with. But if I look at my other one, if this is 30 degrees, that means that this has to be 60 degrees because these add up to 180. So in this case, I have a special 30, 60, 90 triangle, which means I don't have to do a squared plus b squared equals c squared. I can use my shortcuts to figure out what x and y are. So let's identify the sides of the triangle that you know. I know the hypotenuse, and I'm looking for both the long side right here. This is across from the 60, so I know it's the long side, and my x is going to be my short side. So I'm looking for the long and the short. I'll give you a hint. If you know the hypotenuse, it's a lot easier to find the short side first and then find the long side, okay? Because if I look at my formulas that we came up with, none of my formulas compare the hypotenuse with the long side. So even though I know the hypotenuse and I want the long side, I don't have an equation to do that. So we're going to go hypotenuse to short side. And I know that the equation that I want, if I look back, I know the hypotenuse. So the equation that I want to use is this one right here, because I know the hypotenuse and this is the triangle I'm using. So in that equation, my short side is equal to, we'll write it down here. My short side is equal to my hypotenuse divided by 2. And my hypotenuse is 40 divided by 2, just becomes 20. So that means that x equals 20. My short side right here is 20 long. Now that I know the short side, I have a formula to compare that to my long side, which is why we found the short side first. If I know the short side, I know that my long side, I just have to multiply by the square root of 3. So for my long side, I take the short side times the square root of 3, and my short side was 20, square root 3. And the nice thing about this homework assignment is that right there is going to be your answer. It doesn't want ugly decimals. For the most part, most of them will say use radical form, and square root of 3 is already simplified. So this right here would be your answer, 20 square root 3. Okay, let's do a couple more. We're going to do 4, 5, 6 examples, and then you can go ahead, do the homework, and give this a shot. So when I look at this triangle, I know this is 90, this is 45, which means this one is also 45. So I'm using a special 45-45 triangle. And I know in a 45-45 triangle that this is my short side. And I know that my hypotenuse equals my short side multiplied by the square root of 2. And that's what I'm looking for, is my hypotenuse. So I just plug in the values that I know. I know that my short side is 60 times the square root of 2. And again, this is simplified. This is, so my y equals 60 square root 2. I can't simplify this any further, so that would be my answer. I'm already done. Okay. In the second one, I have a 30, 60, 90 triangle. So I'm going to use those special formulas. And it gives me the long side because it's across from the 60. So D is going to be my short side and F is going to be my hypotenuse. Now remember, I don't really know anything that goes from the hypotenuse and the long side. So we're going to use the short side first. I need to go from my long side to my short side. And the formula that I want, if I remember, the long side equals the short side times the square root 3, which means I gave you that other formula that the short side, I just divided by the square root of 3 on both of these. The short side equals the long side divided by square root 3. So if my long side is 5 divided by square root 3, that's my short side. Now, the homework is really inconsistent. On this homework assignment, it will count this as a correct answer. On the next homework assignment, it's not going to like this answer because it doesn't like having a square root on the bottom. So just in case you run into that problem where it says this is not correct, the reason it's not correct is because we have square root of 3 on the bottom. And the way we get rid of that, if I have 5 divided by the square root of 3, if you remember, to get rid of the radical on the bottom, I multiply the top and the bottom by that square root. And the reason I do that is because the square root of 3 times the square root of 3 is just 3. So I get rid of my square root on the bottom. And then 5 square root 3 would go on the top. So it looks like a messier problem than this answer, a messier answer, excuse me. But sometimes the computer wants no radical on the bottom. Sometimes it will accept it. So you can try this one first. If it says it's wrong, multiply top and bottom by that square root, and you should be fine. So now I know that the short side, we're going to go ahead and use this answer for now. The short side is 5 divided by square root 3. Now I want to know the hypotenuse. And the hypotenuse is equal to the short side multiplied by 2. It's just twice as long. So if I take 5 square root 3 and multiply by 2, that becomes 10 over the square root of 3. And that would be your answer for F. Okay, let's try 2 more. I have a 30, 60, 90. This is my long side. Here's my hypotenuse, and here's my short side. So again, I can't go from long to hypotenuse. So I'm going to go from the long side to the short side. And if I use my formulas, my short side equals the long side divided by the square root 3, which is 2 square root 3. That's my long side, but I divide by square root 3. And the square root of 3 divided by the square root of 3 goes away, so I'm just left with 2. So y is equal to 2, which is really nice because to go from the short side to the hypotenuse, remember the hypotenuse is 2 times the short side, which is just 2 times 2, which is 4. So x would equal 4. If you need to rewind and watch that one again, go ahead. Last triangle, 45, 45. So this is another special triangle where 10 is my hypotenuse and x is my short side. And I have a couple equations to look at. I know that the hypotenuse equals the hypotenuse equals the short side times the square root of 2. So my other formula said that the short side is equal to the hypotenuse divided by the square root of 2. I know the hypotenuse, so I'm going to use this one. My short side equals 10 divided by square root 2. The computer will probably take that as an answer. x equals 10 square root 2. But if not, it's because the square root 2 is on the bottom. So you have to go 10 over square root 2. To get rid of the square root of 2, I just multiply by it. But if I multiply the bottom, I have to multiply the top. So on top, I get 10 square root 2 divided by square root 2 multiplied equals 2. And 10 root 2 over 2, the 10 divided by 2 simplifies to 5 root 2 on top. And the 2 goes away on the bottom because it got divided by the 10. So 5 square root 2 is another answer for x. Both of these should work. They're the same answer. But on some of the problems, if it doesn't like this answer, you have to rationalize the denominator. You've got to get rid of that square root. Okay, 2-story problems, and then the time's all yours. The 4 blades of a helicopter meet at right angles and are all the same length. So I have the blades of a helicopter, and it says that they meet at right angles. So this is a right angle, and they're all the same length, which means if I draw the outside, if I connect the corners, what that means is that this, first of all, is a square. And in a square, if I go from one corner to the other, now that I know what it looks like, in a square, if I go from one corner to the other, these are 45 degrees. So this is my 90, these are 45. And it says that the distance between the 2 tips of adjacent blades is 36 feet. So from the tip of this blade to the tip of this blade is 36. So this right here is 36 feet. How long is each blade? So it wants to know how long each of the blades is that goes from the middle, obviously, to the corner. So if I have my other diagonal right here, here's a 90-degree angle. This 90 degree got cut in half. So here's 45. So I've got 45, 45. And then I've got these 2 short sides that I'm looking for. These are my S's. And this right here is actually my hypotenuse. So if the hypotenuse equals the short side times the square root of 2, I know the hypotenuse. So I'm going to use my other formula to find the short side that says the hypotenuse divided by square root 2. So hypotenuse goes on top, 36 divided by square root 2. That looks like a good answer. 36 divided by the square root 2. If it doesn't like the square root of 2 on bottom, I'm going to multiply the top by square root 2 and the bottom by square root 2. So 36 root 2 on top. Square root of 2 times the square root of 2 is 2. And then 36 divided by 2 becomes 18, and I'm left with square root 2. So you have 2 possible answers. Either way, you're going to get the same. It's the same answer. It's just written 2 different ways. Okay. All right. Try one more. Again, I think it would be a good idea if you tried this on your own before you watch me solve the problem. So maybe try to set this one up on your own and then go ahead and give it a try. So it says a rectangular park has a walkway. So first of all, I have a rectangle park. And it says there's a walkway that joins the opposite corners. So I have a walkway right here that goes from corner to corner. A triangle formed from the 2 sides of the park and the walkway is a 30, 60, 90 triangle. So here's my 90. And this is going to be my 30 since this is the short side. And this is going to be my 60 since this is the long side. If the short side of the park measures 150 feet, what is the length? So it wants to know this part right here, the long side, and it gives me the short side. So if I go back to my formulas and look at what goes from the short to the long side in a 30, 60, 90, I know that the long side equals the short side times the square root of 3. And my short side is 150. And then multiply by the square root of 3. That's my answer. Because this doesn't simplify anymore. If it asks for a decimal, go ahead, plug it in your calculator and round it the way that it wants you to. But I think it's going to want an exact answer. All right, so homework number, I believe this one is homework number 26. You're just using, oh, now I got to go back a little bit. You're just using these formulas, these special triangles, to solve for missing sides. So remember to figure out which kind of triangle you're using and then decide which formula. If you know the sides, use that formula. If you know the hypotenuse, use the other formula that I gave you. So again, it's homework number 26. This is going to be due on Thursday. So make sure you get this done between now and then. If you have any questions, come see me.